In the sweltering heart of Augusta, Georgia, a young woman named Lily Chen vanished from the cool, fragrant haven of her own flower shop in 2003, leaving behind only a discarded apron and a pair of gardening shears. For 22 agonizing years, her disappearance became a ghost story, whispered along the Savannah River, a testament to a crime that seemed to have been swallowed whole by the humid southern air. The investigation withered, suspects were cleared, and hope for her family became a brittle, fragile thing. But in 2025, a new generation of investigators, armed with technology unimaginable at the time of her disappearance, looked not for fingerprints or blood, but at the microscopic golden dust clinging to the old, forgotten shears. This trail of rare, exotic pollen would lead them not to a hardened criminal, but to a reclusive local botanist, a man who had hidden his monstrous secret behind a wall of unassuming eccentricity for over 2 decades, proving that sometimes the most profound darkness resides where no one ever thinks to look. The oppressive July heat of 2003 had settled over Augusta like a wet blanket, pressing down on the asphalt of Broad Street and making the air thick enough to taste. Inside petal and stem, however, a different world existed. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth, cut stems, and the sweet perfume of freesia. This was Lily Chen's sanctuary, a small corner of the world she had built, with her own 2 hands, a testament to a passion that had bloomed in her since she was a little girl arranging dandelions in a jam jar. At 23, Lily was a study in quiet grace. She moved through her shop with a focused, gentle energy, her slender fingers deftly wiring a corsage or stripping thorns from a rose stem. She had a kind face, framed by a curtain of straight black hair, and her smile was a rare but radiant thing that she saved for her most cherished customers and the sight of a particularly perfect peony. She wore her work apron, a simple canvas garment smudged with green, like a second skin. Around her neck, she always wore a small silver locket, a gift from her parents, Wei and May, containing a microscopic photo of them and her younger brother, Sam. Lily's dreams were as carefully cultivated as her flowers. She spoke of one day studying the art of ikebana in Japan, of expanding her shop, of filling the city with color and life. She was hardworking and deeply loved, a steady, bright presence in the lives of her family and her small circle of friends. She was dating a young man named Mark, a local musician she had met a year prior. Their relationship was easy and full of laughter, a gentle counterpoint to her focused ambition. On that Tuesday, July 15th, her day had been utterly ordinary. She had woken early to go to the wholesale flower market, her small van loaded with buckets. She spent the morning processing the new arrivals, her hands submerged in cool water as she trimmed and prepared the blooms. An afternoon wedding consultation had gone well. The bride-to-be left the shop beaming, clutching a sketch Lily had made of the proposed bouquet. The last customer, a regular picking up a simple arrangement for his wife's anniversary, left just before 5 o'clock. Lily's final act of the day was a phone call to her mother. She confirmed she would be home for dinner around 6:30, promising to pick up some dessert on the way. May Chen could hear the familiar sounds of the shop in the background, the soft snip of shears, the rustle of wrapping paper, the faint chime of the bell above the door. Lily had sounded happy, tired but content. It was the last time her mother would ever hear her voice. At 6 o'clock, Mark arrived at the shop as planned. He was going to help her with the final cleanup before they headed to her parents' house together. But when he pushed open the glass door, the little bell chiming into a silent room, he found the shop empty. A half-finished arrangement of lilies and delphiniums sat on the main workbench, a single fallen petal on the swept floor. The air was still cool, the scent of flowers thick and cloying, Nothing seemed out of place, yet the stillness felt deeply wrong. He called her name, the sound swallowed by the quiet. He checked the small back room, the tiny office, the restroom. All were empty. On a hook by the back door, her purse and keys were gone, which offered a brief moment of relief. Perhaps she had just stepped out for a moment, an errand she forgot to mention. But on the floor, near the workbench, lay her canvas apron discarded in a heap as if hastily pulled off. Beside it were her favorite gardening shears, their blades slightly agape. The first flicker of worry began in Mark's chest. Lily was meticulous. She never would have left her apron on the floor, or left the shop in such a state without locking up. He waited, the minutes stretching into an eternity, the floral scents in the air starting to feel suffocating. He tried her cell phone, but it went straight to a crackling, distant voicemail. The sun began to dip below the rooftops, casting long, menacing shadows through the shop's large front window. By 6:45, Wei and Mei Chen were growing concerned. Lily was never late without calling. Their own calls to her cell phone met the same fate as Mark's. May's maternal unease sharpened into a spike of real fear. She called Mark, her voice tight with anxiety. He told her he was at the shop, that Lily was not there, that her apron was on the floor. The shared panic crackled over the phone line, an unspoken understanding that this was not a simple delay. This was something else. Wei Chen, a man of profound calm, felt his composure cracking. He told Mark to stay put and informed his wife they were going to the shop immediately. The short drive across town felt endless, every red light a personal torment. When they arrived, the sight of Mark's pale, terrified face, standing in the doorway of the darkened shop, confirmed their worst fears. The sanctuary their daughter had built now felt like a tomb. At 7:15, after another frantic round of unanswered calls and a fruitless check with her closest friends, Wei Chen made the call he never imagined he would have to make. He dialed 911, his voice, usually so steady, trembling as he reported his daughter missing. The initial police response was measured, treating it as a possible case of a young woman who had simply changed her plans. But the Chens and Mark knew Lily better. This was not in her character. She was responsible to a fault. 2 uniformed officers arrived, their presence both a comfort and a terrifying confirmation of the situation's gravity. They took statements, their pens scratching methodically in their notepads. They walked through the shop, their heavy boots echoing on the concrete floor. One officer noted the cash register was untouched, the day's earnings still inside. This was not a robbery. This detail, meant to be reassuring, only made the situation more sinister. What then was it? As night fell completely, the investigation escalated. Detectives arrived, their faces grim. The shop was cordoned off with yellow tape, its cheerful facade now marking the boundary of a crime scene. A K9 unit was brought in, the dog sniffing intently at the discarded apron before leading its handler on a short, frantic trail that ended abruptly at the curb of the street, the scent vanishing into the exhaust fumes of the evening traffic. She had gotten into a vehicle. The question was, had she done so willingly? The forensics team moved in, their work clinical and detached, amidst the blooming flowers that seemed to mock the grim proceedings. They dusted for fingerprints, photographed every surface, and carefully collected the apron and the shears, bagging them as potential evidence. They noted a small scuff mark on the floor near the back door and a potted fern that had been knocked over, spilling dark soil across the tiles. It was a subtle sign of a possible struggle, a quiet disruption in the otherwise serene environment. Suspicion, as it so often does in these cases, fell first and hardest on the last person to have seen her and the first to find her gone. Her boyfriend, Mark. He was taken to the station for questioning, the initial empathy of the officers replaced by a focused professional skepticism. He recounted his story again and again, his voice raw with grief and disbelief. He described their plans for the evening, their relationship, Lily's habits. He had an alibi for the time between her mother's phone call and his arrival at the shop, a receipt from a gas station across town, but the timeline was tight. For the public and for the police, he was the logical suspect. The boyfriend is always the first suspect. Whispers started in the community, fueled by fear and the need for a simple explanation for a terrifying event. Mark, already shattered by Lily's disappearance, now found himself isolated, viewed with suspicion by the very community that should have been offering him comfort. He was a secondary victim of the crime, his reputation tarnished by a tragedy he had no part in creating. The interrogation was grueling. Detectives pressed him for hours, searching for inconsistencies in his story, for any hint of deception. They asked about arguments, about jealousy, about secrets. Mark had nothing to offer them but the plain, agonizing truth. He loved Lily, and he had no idea what had happened to her. He willingly gave his DNA and fingerprints, desperate to prove his innocence and to turn the police's attention toward finding the real person responsible. While Mark was under scrutiny, other detectives pursued different angles. They looked into disgruntled customers, though Lily's business record showed nothing but satisfied clients. They investigated known criminals in the area, pulling records of individuals with histories of assault or abduction. Each lead was a hopeful thread that, when pulled, led to nothing. The city of Augusta felt small, yet Lily Chen had vanished from its center as if she had turned to smoke. The initial forensic analysis of the evidence from the shop yielded frustratingly little. The few partial fingerprints they lifted did not match anyone in the system, nor did they match Mark. The scuff mark on the floor could have been made by anyone. The overturned pot was ambiguous. The most promising items were the apron and the shears, but in 2003 the technology for trace evidence analysis was limited. They were stored away in an evidence locker, silent witnesses waiting for a future science to give them a voice. Days turned into weeks. The search for Lily consumed the city. Volunteers led by the tireless Wei and Mei Chen scoured parks, riverbanks, and abandoned buildings. Missing person posters went up on every telephone pole and in every storefront window, Lily's kind face smiling out over a world that had become a nightmare for her family. The local news covered the story nightly, but with no new leads and no body, the reports became repetitive, the airtime shorter. The police officially cleared Mark after his alibi was firmly corroborated, and no evidence could be found to link him to the scene in any criminal way. But the public's suspicion lingered for years, a cruel shadow that followed him long after the police had moved on. The investigation, once a flurry of intense activity, slowed to a crawl. The leads dried up. The detectives, burdened by new cases, had no choice but to shift their focus. The file on Lily Chen grew thicker with dead-end reports and fruitless interviews. Eventually, the inevitable happened. After more than a year of exhaustive but unsuccessful work, Lily's case was officially moved to the cold case unit. The designation was a procedural necessity, but for the Chen family, it felt like a final, devastating blow. It was an admission of defeat, a formal acknowledgement that the trail had gone cold, perhaps forever. The yellow tape came down from the flower shop, but for Wei and Mei, the entire world now felt like a crime scene. They refused to let their daughter be forgotten. They vowed that as long as they were alive, Lily's case would never truly be cold. They established a foundation in her name, offering scholarships to young horticultural students. They gave interviews to any newspaper or television station that would listen, keeping her story alive in the public consciousness. They became reluctant experts in a world of grief they never asked to join. their faces etched with a sorrow that never faded. Every year, on July 15th, they held a candlelight vigil outside the shuttered doors of Petal and Stem. In the early years, large crowds would gather, a sea of flickering lights and shared grief. As time wore on, the crowds grew smaller, the news cameras stopped coming, the world, with its relentless cycle of new tragedies, began to move on. But for the Chens and a small, loyal group of friends, the vigil was a sacred ritual, a promise to the ghost of a girl who loved flowers that she would not be abandoned. The years passed in a slow, painful blur. 5 years, 10, 15. Sam, Lily's younger brother, grew up, went to college, and started a family of his own, all under the shadow of his sister's absence. The silver locket she wore became a family legend, a talisman they prayed would one day be found. The city of Augusta changed, new buildings rose and old ones fell, but the empty storefront of Petal and Stem remained a stubborn, silent monument to the city's most haunting mystery. The hope of finding Lily alive had long since withered and died, replaced by a grim, desperate need for answers, for justice, for a place to lay her to rest. Then, in the spring of 2025, 22 years after Lily vanished, a team of city workers was performing maintenance on a storm drain system in a quiet, overlooked park on the outskirts of the city. Deep within a concrete culvert, clogged with decades of silt and debris, one of the workers made a grim discovery, a small, muddy object that, upon closer inspection, revealed itself to be a human bone. The work stopped immediately. The police were called. A forensic anthropology team was dispatched to the scene, and over the next several days they carefully excavated the culvert. They unearthed a partial human skeleton, degraded by years of moisture and shifting earth. With the remains, they found the corroded remnants of a silver chain and a small mud-caked locket. When Wei and Mei Chen were shown a cleaned and magnified image of the locket, their breath caught in their throats. It was hers. After 22 years, the agonizing limbo was over. Their daughter had been found. The confirmation brought with it a tidal wave of renewed grief, a pain so sharp and fresh it felt as if she had disappeared only yesterday. But mixed with the sorrow was a sliver of something else. Resolve. The discovery of Lily's remains transformed her case from a missing person investigation into a homicide. It was a catalyst, a reason to reopen the dusty files and look at the old evidence with new eyes. The case was assigned to Detective Isabella Rossi, a sharp, tenacious investigator in the cold case unit, who had been a child when Lily first went missing. Detective Rossi immersed herself in the original case files, reading through the old reports, the witness statements, the dead-end leads. She felt the frustration of the original investigators, the sense of hitting a wall at every turn, but Rossi had an arsenal of tools at her disposal that they could have only dreamed of. DNA technology had evolved exponentially. Forensic science had made leaps that were once the realm of fiction. She requested that all the original evidence, carefully preserved for over 2 decades, be sent for re-examination. The apron yielded nothing new, but the gardening shears, Lily's favorite pair, held a secret. Under a high-powered microscope, a forensic analyst noticed something the original team had overlooked as simple dust or dirt. It was pollen, microscopic grains preserved in a tiny crevice near the hinge of the shears. In 2003, analyzing such a small sample would have been impossible. In 2025, it was a doorway. Rossi consulted with a specialist in the burgeoning field of forensic palynology, the study of pollen and spores as evidence. Dr. Alistair Finch, a leading expert at Georgia State University, was brought onto the case. He explained that pollen grains are like nature's fingerprints, unique to specific plant species and incredibly durable. They could tell a story of where an object had been, a story that could last for decades. Under an electron microscope, the golden dust from the shears revealed its secrets. Most of the grains were common to the Augusta area: pine, oak, ragweed, but mixed in were several grains of a pollen Dr. Finch had never seen before in a forensic context. It was from Paphiopedilum rothschildianum, the gold of Kinabalu orchid. It was an incredibly rare, exotic, and notoriously difficult plant to cultivate, native only to a single mountain in Borneo. It was also highly illegal to own or trade, without extensive, nearly impossible to obtain permits. This was the breakthrough. Lily Chen had not just been abducted from her shop. She, or at least her shears, had been in the presence of one of the rarest flowers on Earth. What were the chances of such a plant existing in Augusta, Georgia? The investigation now had a new, incredibly specific focus: find the orchid, and they would find their killer. A person who cultivated such a plant would not be an ordinary gardener. They would be an obsessive, a specialist, likely operating in secret due to the plant's protected status. Detective Rossi's team began a painstaking search. They cross-referenced lists of licensed botanists, horticultural society members, and known collectors of exotic plants. They scoured old permit applications and even black market forums online. The search was a digital needle in a haystack, but the specificity of the orchid was their guide. After weeks of methodical work, a name emerged: Arthur Finch. No relation to the university expert, but a local man who, back in the late 1990s, had been cited for a minor violation involving the importation of an unpermitted plant species. The name was almost too perfect to be a coincidence. Arthur Finch was a reclusive man in his late 60s who lived in a small, unassuming house on a quiet street not far from Lily's shop. Neighbors described him as odd but harmless, a quiet man who kept to himself and spent all his time in his garden and a large, heavily shaded greenhouse in his backyard. He rarely had visitors and was known to be intensely private. He had lived in that same house for over 30 years, a quiet fixture in the neighborhood, a ghost hiding in plain sight. The 1990s permit violation file was still in the county archives. Inside, stapled to the paperwork, was a small plastic plant tag that had been seized as part of the original investigation. On a hunch, Rossi sent the tag to the crime lab. Technology had advanced to the point where even the faintest touch DNA left on an object years ago could sometimes be recovered. The lab technicians painstakingly swabbed the tag, and against all odds, they isolated a degraded but viable DNA profile. It belonged to Arthur Finch. Now they had a suspect, a motive taking shape, and a possible location. But they needed to connect Arthur Finch directly to the crime scene in 2003. They needed his DNA to compare against any potential trace evidence that might still exist from the original investigation. A full-scale forensic review was launched on every item from the crime scene. They focused on the knot in the apron strings, a place where the killer might have touched it. Deep within the fibers, they found a minuscule speck of biological material, too small to be analyzed in 2003. Using modern amplification techniques, the lab managed to extract a partial male DNA profile from that speck. It was their ghost's genetic signature. The next step was to obtain a fresh DNA sample from Arthur Finch to see if it was a match. A surveillance team was assigned to watch his house. For days, they observed his quiet, predictable routine. He would emerge in the morning to collect his newspaper, spend hours in his greenhouse, and retreat inside as evening fell. He was a creature of habit, a man who had built a life designed to avoid attention. The team needed a way to get his DNA without alerting him. The opportunity came on the 4th day of surveillance. Finch placed his weekly trash and recycling bins at the curb. After the garbage truck had come and gone and Finch had retreated back inside, Two undercover officers dressed as city workers approached the bins. They collected a discarded water bottle and a used paper napkin. Both were sent to the lab for priority processing. The entire cold case unit held its breath. The call from the lab came less than 24 hours later. The DNA from the water bottle was a perfect match to the partial profile developed from the apron string. The probability of it belonging to anyone other than Arthur Finch was 1 in billions. They had him. After 22 years, the ghost who had haunted Augusta had a name and an address. The arrest was planned with meticulous care. In the pre-dawn hours of a cool May morning, a tactical team assembled silently on the street outside Arthur Finch's home. They moved with quiet efficiency, surrounding the small house. Just as the first light of day began to streak the sky, they executed the warrant. A thunderous knock on the door was followed by the command, "Police, open up!" The man who answered the door was not a monster in appearance. He was small and frail-looking, with thinning gray hair and bewildered eyes behind thick glasses. He wore pajamas and a faded bathrobe. He looked like someone's quiet, eccentric grandfather. The sight of the heavily armed officers seemed to genuinely shock him, his face a mask of confusion. The contrast between this unassuming old man and the brutal crime he was accused of was jarring. His neighbors, woken by the commotion, peered out from behind their curtains, their faces filled with disbelief. At the station, Arthur Finch was initially defiant in his denial. He sat in the interrogation room, his hands trembling slightly, and claimed he knew nothing about Lily Chen. He said he had never even been to her flower shop. He was just a quiet man who liked his plants. But Detective Rossi was prepared. She didn't press him with accusations. Instead, she began to lay out the evidence piece by piece on the table in front of him. She started with the pollen. She showed him the magnified images of the Paphiopedilum rothschildianum grains found on the shears. She watched as a flicker of recognition, quickly suppressed, crossed his face. Then she laid down the lab report from the plant tag from the 1990s. And finally, she placed the DNA report on the table, the one that linked him irrefutably to the apron Lily had worn on the day she died. She simply slid the paper across the table and waited. The silence in the room was absolute. Arthur Finch stared at the report, his face slowly crumbling. The decades of carefully constructed denial of a compartmentalized life were being dismantled before his eyes by a single sheet of paper. His shoulders slumped. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, and then, in a low, raspy voice, he began to talk. The story that emerged was one of petty obsession and explosive, uncontrolled rage. He confessed that he had been a customer at Lily's shop. He was impressed by her knowledge and skill, and he had visited several times, hiding his own deep expertise behind the facade of a simple hobbyist. On that July afternoon in 2003, he had gone to her shop to special order some materials. He arrived just after her last customer left. They were alone. He had been talking about his passion for rare orchids, and in a moment of arrogant pride, he had shown her a photograph of his prize, the gold of Kinabalu orchid, blooming in his secret greenhouse. He expected her to be impressed, to share in his passion. But Lily, who was not just a florist but a deeply ethical botanist, recognized the flower immediately. She knew what it was, and she knew it was almost certainly illegal. She had gently but firmly told him that he needed to report the plant to the authorities, that possessing it was a serious crime. Her sense of duty, her simple, straightforward morality, had collided with his lifetime of obsessive secrecy. Finch had panicked. He had pleaded with her, begged her to forget what she saw. But Lily was resolute. She told him it was the right thing to do. In his mind, her quiet insistence became a threat that would destroy his hidden world, the only thing that gave his life meaning. His panic curdled into a terrifying rage. He had grabbed her, trying to silence her, and a struggle ensued. She had tried to fight back, knocking over a fern. He had overpowered her, his fury absolute and blinding. In that moment of violence, he had ended her life. The rest of the confession was a chilling account of a frantic cover-up. He had bundled her body into his van, driven to the remote park, and hidden her in the storm culvert, believing she would never be found. He had taken her purse and keys, driving her car a few miles away, and abandoning it to create a false trail. He had returned to his quiet life, tending to his plants, the monstrous secret locked away. For 22 years, he had lived with what he had done. The quiet, eccentric neighbor, the harmless man who loved flowers. The trial of Arthur Finch was a somber, methodical affair. The prosecution, led by the district attorney, presented the case with devastating clarity. They laid out the timeline, the scientific evidence of the pollen, and the unassailable DNA match. Dr. Alistair Finch testified about the rarity of the orchid, explaining to the jury just how improbable it was for that specific pollen to be found anywhere else in the state, let alone the country. The centerpiece of the trial was the videotaped confession, played for a silent, captivated courtroom. The defense had little to work with. They attempted to paint Finch as a lonely, mentally fragile man, but they could not refute the physical evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, their verdict was swift and unanimous. Guilty of first-degree murder. Wei and Mei Chen, who had sat through every moment of the trial, clutched each other's hands, tears streaming down their faces. They were not tears of joy, but of a profound, painful relief. At his sentencing, Arthur Finch, stripped of his secrets and his quiet life, stood before the court as the judge condemned him for the life he had stolen. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, he looked not at the judge or the jury, but at Lily's parents, his face a blank mask that offered no remorse, no apology. A week after the sentencing, the Chen family held a final memorial for Lily. They did not bury her in a somber cemetery. Instead, they scattered her ashes in the botanical gardens, a place she had loved, a place filled with the life and beauty she had dedicated her own short life to creating. Mark was there, his name finally and fully cleared, standing with his own family, a quiet figure marked by a tragedy that had shaped his entire adult life. It was not a happy ending, but it was an ending. It was a form of peace. It was justice delivered 2 decades late, but delivered all the same. The case of Lily Chen serves as a powerful testament to the relentless march of science and the unyielding nature of truth. It reminds us that evidence, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, can hold the key to unlocking even the coldest of cases. The microscopic grains of pollen on a pair of shears, silent for 22 years, were ultimately able to speak for a victim who could not, their testimony more powerful than any human witness. It underscores the chilling reality that the most monstrous acts are not always committed by obvious villains, but can be hidden behind the most mundane of facades. A quiet neighbor, a reclusive hobbyist, a man who simply loved his garden too much. This story is also a profound tribute to the endurance of love and the persistence of family. For 2 decades, when the world had all but forgotten, the Chen family refused to give up hope for justice. Their vigil was not just for their daughter, but for the principle that no life should be so easily erased, that no family should be left to wander in the dark forever. Their journey through unimaginable grief to a place of painful closure highlights a fundamental human need for answers, for accountability, and for the final, solemn act of laying a loved one to rest. It shows that while justice can be delayed, the fight for it, fueled by memory and love, can ultimately triumph.